Hey, it's A Humble Collector here, and today's video we're taking a look at the two-panel death card of Alois Greissl. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. This is a World War I card, which we have not done in a while. And starting at the top here, the virtuous youth died a heroic death for the fatherland on May 9th, 1915, near Fromelles, at the age of 23. Alois Greissl, a servant from Pfaffing, and a soldier in the 16th Reserve Infantry Regiment, 5th Company. Now, I was able to find a bit more information on Alois. He was born on February 13th, 1891 in Traunstein, and his cause of death is listed in this reference I'm putting up on screen, but it was really difficult to make out, so I'm not 100% sure what it was. Now, in this case, the Reserve Infantry Regiment that Alois was a part of was actually the Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, which is the same unit that Hitler served in during the First World War. And Fromelles, which was listed here, Hitler actually painted a picture of in 1915, so I'll go ahead and put that up on screen there. I thought that was kind of interesting. And Alois' date of death here, May 9th, was the day of the Battle of Aubers. So the British objective was the Aubers Ridge, which had been attacked during the Battle of Neuve Chapelle 2 months earlier. And following this battle, the Germans spent a lot of time fortifying their positions on the ridge, and the British really didn't have a whole lot of intelligence on the work that had been done up there. Now, also at the beginning of the attack, the British bombardment failed to break the German line or knock out the machine guns, and the British were also suffering from logistical issues. So this ended up being a very bad day for the British. They would suffer 11,161 casualties, while the Germans suffered just over 900. And 4 Victorious Crosses would be awarded for actions on that day, and I have bit of information about those 4 Victorious Crosses. But before we get there, I actually found this lovely book, Hitler's First War by Thomas Weber, which is actually a really good account of the 16th Reserve Bavarian Infantry Regiment. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of read a few pages here dealing with the May 9th battle. I haven't read the whole book, just as a... so I can't really recommend it fully based off that, but what I have read has been very, very well done. So starting off here on page 86, May brought an increase in artillery fire and in bombs dropped from British planes, but it also brought a decrease in machine gun fire. Above all, it brought the glories of May to the region around Fromelles and Fornes, when Western Europe looks its most beautiful, thus lifting everybody's mood. The wonderful spring days have spread a rare natural glory over our region. Everything is green and blooming, the birds sing and chirp, wrote Father Norbert. Were it not for the war and all the traces of destruction, one could feel completely happy where we are. For the men of the List Regiment, May 9th was supposed to have been just another day of war as usual, with some intermittent fire, maybe some patrols, and possibly some more mockery from their British counterparts. Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 had been lucky enough not to have been thrown into the Second Battle of Ypres, which had started in April. Albert Weisgerber and his men from 1st Company, now in reserve for a few days while the men of 2nd and 3rd Battalions were manning the trenches, were preparing for another day of relative comfort in Fornes behind the line. But at 5 a.m., shells started to rain down heavily on Fornes. 45 minutes later, the distant sound of heavy barrages of fire was a telltale sign that this day was to be different for Weisgerber and his men. 15 minutes later, the soldiers of 1st Company could see the men of regimental headquarters, possibly including Private Hitler, racing off towards the advanced post of regimental HQ at Fromelles Castle. As night turned into a glorious sunny May day, the heavy bombardment continued. The fire created havoc amongst troops of 2nd and 3rd Battalions at the front. Otto Bestel of 8th Company saw how, a few meters away, a British shell tore the body of his comrade Josef Meisel into 2 pieces, severing the lower part of the body from the upper half. At 7 a.m., Bestel and Weisgerber heard an ear-splitting detonation caused by the explosion of 2 mines that British troops had placed in a tunnel they had dug right under the position of 10th Company. Amongst them was Adolf Meyer, who had been transferred to the company. A pillar of fire erupted, fountains of soil, rubble, as well as dozens of men from 10th Company were catapulted into the air. Unlike scores of his comrades, Meyer had been lucky enough to stand away from the explosion. Together with other survivors of the explosion, he was encircled by British troops all day before he was freed late at night. Of the 89 soldiers from 10th Company who died that day, the bodies of only 40 soldiers were ever recovered from the craters of the explosion. Many of the bodies did not show any wounds, a clear sign that they had either been killed by the air pressure from the shell explosion or suffocated, buried under meters of soil and debris. Back in the battle, British troops from the 8th Division of the BEF, who had lain hidden in the yellow fields behind the British trenches, poured forward. Each of them carrying 200 bullets, waterproof blankets, and food supplies for 2 days. They now quickly moved through the gap created in the front under the cover of the black and yellow smoke of the explosion. As the soldiers of the List Regiment were later to find out, the attack was part of the Battle of Aubers Ridge, a sideshow British troops were putting on to ease the French attempt to break through German lines further south. Many groups of men from Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 were now trapped by British troops. Some fell into the hands of the British, amongst them Engelbert Niederhofer from 9th Company. Niederhofer and his comrades had been at the center of the heavy shelling that preceded the British advance. He had twice been buried alive. After his comrades had rescued him the second time, only 8 men of his squad were still alive. The ordeal was, however, far from over. They found themselves surrounded by British soldiers who took them prisoner. A few days later, while giving evidence to his officers after his eventual lucky escape from the British, Niederhofer recalled the occasion. The Englishmen came into our trench and took the 8 of us prisoner and led us towards the right to the rear of the position. Injured Englishmen lay there on the ground, who immediately shot at us from all sides when we arrived. 2 of my mates collapsed straight away. I jumped so as to duck into a hole, as did 2 fellow soldiers who, however, were hit in the event, one in the foot, the other in the shoulder. Now the 3 of us lay still on our stomachs in the hole. After approximately half an hour, my mate to the right of me moved. Immediately, a fatal shot hit him in the head. Another hit me in the left buttock. When after approximately 2 hours, my other mate lifted his head slightly, he was shot too, and was instantly killed. All shots came from injured Englishmen who lay about 5 meters away. Then, I was hit by a second shot at the same spot as before, but I'm not sure if I was hit by an infantry bullet or a shell splinter. I remained lying on the ground as if dead for the entire day. At night, around midnight, I removed my coat and crawled through the position past the injured and dead. A gap in the trench created by a shell allowed me to get back here without being noticed by the British. Around 1 a.m., I reached the German positions. It was at least partly for fear of enduring such an ordeal that the men of the List Regiment ferociously and aggressively fought back during the British assault. The hand grenades and machine guns in the possession of the men of the List Regiment gave them the tools and the confidence to resist forcefully. They indeed used the machine guns and hand grenades to great lethal effect, thus slowing down the British attack. Chaos reigned wherever troops from Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 and British troops engaged with each other. On many an occasion, close-range bayonet combat ensued. In a scene depicted in a photograph that became one of the most reproduced images from the List Regiment, Plate 13, Weisgerber and his men, meanwhile, were waiting all day under the trees of the park of Florence Castle, thus being protected against detection by British planes, ready to be deployed. As dusk was approaching, Weisgerber and his men, as well as the other companies of 1st Battalion, were finally ordered to move forward, joining the fierce combat that had gone on all day. After heavy fighting throughout the night, the German lines were back in the possession of Hitler's regiment by 5 a.m. on May 10th. A total of 142 British soldiers had fallen into the hands of the List Regiment, while countless British soldiers lay dead. Yet the price that the men of the Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 had to pay for this was enormous. On 9th and 10th May, 309 men of the List Regiment died, a figure almost as high as during the first battle in November. The total number of casualties ran to approximately 600. Amongst the dead were Albert Weisgerber and 13 of his men, who in the middle of the night had gotten lost on the battlefield and had been ambushed. Weisgerber, who was 37, had been killed by 2 bullets, one of which had hit him in the temple. The death of Albert Weisgerber, one of Bavaria's most famous and successful painters, as well as the commander of the company of which Hitler was still nominally a member, became a symbol of the sacrifices of the men of the List Regiment in the war. For him, the policy of burying fallen soldiers in France, rather than taking dead bodies home to Bavaria, was not followed. After he had initially been buried by his brothers-in-arms in Forns, his body was exhumed, taken to Munich, and buried there in early June in the presence of many soldiers and artists of the avant-gardist Neue Saison. Newspapers, meanwhile, celebrated him as the model of a brave soldier, a leader with incomparable courage, a Schneidigkeit, a man of most noble character. Even in the regimental history of 1932, Albert Weisgerber was to be the celebrated hero of the List Regiment, while only perfunctory lip service was to be paid to that other painter from 1st Company, Adolf Hitler. It was a long time after the battle before any kind of normality returned to the trenches. The massacre of Niederhofer's comrades after they had been taken prisoner by the British no doubt helped to instill into the minds of the men of the regiment a realization that continuing to fight was less dangerous than surrendering. So yeah, overall, apparently the battle on May 9th was significant for the men of the regiment, with the death of Albert Weisgerber, as said there, but also the fact that they had over 309 men killed, which, if you remember earlier, I talked about how total German casualties for the battle were just over 900. So a third of the casualties alone came from the List Regiment, which is Reserve Infantry Regiment 16. So yeah, really cool. As I said, that's really the only part of this book I've read so far, but I'm very much looking forward to reading the rest of it. And kind of moving on, I talked about how 4 Victorious Crosses be awarded for actions this day. I'll go through them now. The first Victorious Cross was for David Finlay, who was a member of the 2nd Battalion Black Watch. He was a Lance Corporal and had led a bombing party of 12 men in the attack until 10 had died. He then sent the 2 remaining men back and carried a wounded soldier back to safety over 100 yards of ground. He would later be killed in action on January 21st, 1916 in Mesopotamia. John Ripley, who was a corporal in the 1st Battalion of the Black Watch, was leading his battalion and was the first man from his battalion to reach the enemy trenches. From there, he directed his men through a gap in the wire and led an assault on a second line of trenches. From there, he defended his position with several other men until they were all knocked out of the fight, with John being wounded in the head. At 47, he was the oldest Victoria's Cross winner of World War I. He survived the war and would die in 1933 after falling off a roof while working as a slater at the age of 65. Charles Sharp, who was an acting corporal in the 2nd Battalion of the Lincolnshire Regiment, was leading a blocking party and was the first to reach the German trench. Using grenades, he cleared a trench 50 yards long. All of his men had been killed or wounded, but with the help of a few other men, they took an additional trench. He survived the war and died in 1963. James Upton, who was a corporal in the 1st Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters, throughout the battle, James would cross into no man's land and would bring back wounded soldiers to safety. One man he was carrying was killed by a shell while on his back. He would survive the war and die in 1949. So yeah, definitely a ferocious battle and just indicative of the slaughter of the Western Front during the First World War. And moving to the bottom of the card here, a young life has ended in a terribly serious battle, and pale he lays on the lawn, the angel of death keeps watch. Move into the joys of heaven, you brave Bavarian hero. Served the king so faithfully, now serve the Lord of the world. And moving to the back here, we have a lovely, mostly black design, which you don't see too often. In the evening, when after a hot battle, the rally was blown, God's death guard announces the names of many brave ones. So yeah, overall, a super interesting card from a very famous unit and a particularly grisly battle. So yeah, I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment down below. Love hearing from you guys. Thank you all for watching. Happy collecting, and I'll see you all again very soon.